intelligently use the fixed and rotary wing capabilities that Congress has approved as a result of the administration's efforts to provide Mexican authorities with the ability to provide endgame. That is, when you pass on intelligence that a Mexican special unit can arrive at precisely the time that it needs to arrive to arrest or to intercept a shipment of drugs. Upholding the rule of law, critically important, winning the public support on both sides of the border for what we're doing. We need to ensure that our two societies are co-stakeholders in this fight that our two governments are waging against organized crime. Because if public opinion does not understand, and we do not explain to public opinion what's at stake, we will lose the support of public opinion on both sides of the border. And we need it as a critical component of our efforts to continue deepening our engagement. We need to continue rebuilding and strengthening institutions, and we need to sustain our efforts in force projection so that we can continue the levels of attrition that we have triggered against the drug syndicates. As we look to what we've achieved these past 3 years through the MEDI initiative, both our countries are looking to continue deepening the work on 4 key pillars. The first one is disrupting the operational capacity of organized crime. The second is institutionalizing Mexico's capacity to sustain the rule of law, and a very important component of this is police and judicial reform. The third one is how our two nations create a 21st century border, not only in terms of infrastructure, but of ensuring that we have a secure border and ensuring that customs officials on both sides of the border or police officers on both sides of the border are not corrupted by the influence of the drug syndicates and by drug money. And finally, one of the most important components of this strategy as we move forward, building strong and resilient communities in both countries where we can bring down levels of demand, where we can enhance our ability to provide harm reduction and harm mitigation in both our societies, and where we can make sure that demand reduction is playing a central role in this equation, in this multifaceted equation of taking on drug traffickers. Many of you have heard an important debate over, well, what does success look like? And I'm sure that in this crowd, there are many of you who have your own readouts or perceptions or descriptions of what success would need to look like in this fight. And let me give you my own. I think that the end game for Mexico is three-pronged. One, we need to bring down the level of violence being unleashed by the drug syndicates against Mexican society. Even though if you look at the numbers today, and the numbers if you compare them to other Latin American countries, or to other Latin American countries that were facing 10 years ago levels of violence like the ones that we're facing, the number of violent deaths per 100,000 inhabitants is not that bad if you look at it in terms of ratios and comparisons. For every 100,000 inhabitants in Mexico today, we have approximately 11 violent deaths. There are countries in the hemisphere today that have not launched an offensive against organized crime, that don't face the challenges that we face in the fight against organized crime, that have ratios of 33 violent deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. There are cities in the hemisphere that have violent death per 100 inhabitant ratios of 90 to 100,000. Again, as I've always said, is the ambassador trying to dispel the challenge that we face as we take on the drug syndicates and the challenge that we face in terms of the number of violent deaths that have been registered in Mexico over the past 3 years? No. But I think we need a fresh doses of perspective into what is and what is not going on in Mexico today. And so I think that one of the prongs of our endgame is that, despite what I've just said, that we continue to abate and bring down the level of violent deaths being unleashed against society. The second prong of our endgame is that, contrary to what I would be doing if I was in El Paso promoting foreign direct investment opportunities and I was here to talk about trade, if I was doing that, I would be probably trying to ensure that we are diminishing the opportunity costs of doing business in Mexico. In the fight against drugs, what this is all about is about raising the opportunity cost of doing business in Mexico. Is this a diplomatic euphemism by the ambassador to say we want them to pack up and go somewhere else? You're absolutely right. I want them to pack up and go somewhere else. Much in the same fashion as what happened in Florida in the 70s when you were so effective that they packed up and went somewhere else. The problem is they came to Mexico. And that's why the challenge that we have as I say this is that the United States and Mexico will have to continue working to develop a regional approach to the fight against drugs, because our success, and the success we're already having, for example, in the patterns of trafficking of cocaine, are spelling disaster for countries in the Central American and Caribbean region, where we've already seen a lot of these operations relocate as a result of our effectiveness in shutting down the flows of cocaine through Mexico. The final prong of the end game for Mexico is that we ensure that we can transit from having a national security problem on our hands to an issue of law and order and public security. The United States has, on any given day, hundreds of people who get killed because of a drug deal gone bad. There are trafficking and distribution networks in the United States, but no one would argue that the United States has a national security problem as it relates to drugs and drug trafficking. It's a law and order, public security, and public health challenge. That's where we need to transit to in Mexico, because today, drug trafficking does pose a national security challenge to Mexico. And we need to transition towards that to be able to move forward in the strategy. At the end of the day, this is not an either-or dilemma. It's not about U-turns, and I do believe in multitasking. I think that you can chew gum, whistle, and talk on the BlackBerry at the same time. And that is what Mexico is trying to do. We could not start this administration by turning a blind eye to the festering corruption that more than a decade of letting the drug traffickers do their business had created in Mexico. We needed to push back, and we needed to push back far, fast, and hard. And that's why President Calderón decided to bring in the armed forces as a stopgap measure to push back, because they were the only institution in Mexico in December 2006 that had the ability and the firepower, because of what we're up against in terms of weapons coming from the other side of the border, to push back. But now we are reaching a stage where what we are creating are the breathing spaces that we need in pushing them back, to then start looking at judicial reform, institutional building, the creation of strong, resilient police units both at the federal, state, and local level, making sure that we can invest in communities, in social development opportunities in the communities that are being ravaged by the drug traffickers. But we could have only reached that point by pushing back. If we had started with this softer approach in December 2006, we may have had success in creating economic opportunities in Ciudad Juarez, but the ability of these drug trafficking syndicates to continue their operations would have been unabated. We needed to push back first to create the space so that we can do all this other stuff that I think all of us agree needs to be done in the fight against drugs. So to those who would suggest, oh, the strategy has failed, or, oh, you need to do a U-turn, I would simply say, you don't know what you're talking about. Mexico has to be able to continue fighting and pushing back against these drug syndicates, and at the same time putting resources, investment of funds into social development, economic programs, into rebuilding communities, into ensuring that now at this stage we can start developing a holistic approach, which we couldn't do on the first day of the administration of President Calderón. That is what Mexico is about. That is what we're trying to do. That is what we're trying to do with our American partners. Octavio Paz, our Nobel Prize winner, once wrote that Mexico and the United States have always had a hard time understanding one another because Mexicans don't know how to speak and Americans don't know how to listen. With these two administrations, Mexicans are speaking loudly and the United States is finally tuning in. Thank you.